And I'm very happy that my good colleague and friend Andrea Ramirez will do the final lecture of today about the need for enabling infrastructure to move forward.
Okay, thank you, Martin. So I'm very happy we finished with a size question, because that is very much related how are you going to build any infrastructure. So my name is Andrea Ramirez, and I work for the Delft University of Technology, but I worked many years here at Copernicus, so thank you for having me feel very homely. So I was asked whether I could say some words about infrastructure, and again, it's a wonder we made technologies work here. Which one? Is the third one? The fourth one? You see? Yeah, this one. How difficult could it be? So when we speak about infrastructure, the question infrastructure for what and what kind, and it's not one infrastructure. So if we are speaking, and I was asked about, e-fuels, and we have CO2 and hydrogen, or CO2, water, and electricity, depending one-step production. What do you need? And if you are just speaking about CO2, then you will have to capture it, wherever it is. You will have to transport it, and more likely you will need some kind of temporal storage. If you are speaking about hydrogen, you either need to have water availability, and there have been a couple of studies on whether or not we are going to have enough water for the hydrogen economy, and it's going to be a question of location. It's a little bit like saying, there is enough food in the world, but there are people hungry. Yes, we have water in the world, but not necessarily in the places where we like to have it, especially as climate change happens. So water, electricity storage. A lot of these processes work 24 hours 7. So yes, it's nice to have renewables, but if I need 24 hours 7 because I have a high capex, a high investment, then I need to have infrastructure in the terms of storage. That storage could be hydrogen. I may be using hydrogen, I still have to transport hydrogen, and I need temporal storage of hydrogen. And I don't know how many people of you have looked at the last report, but hydrogen has a global warming potential. At this moment, I think 2 or 3 weeks ago, the last paper said it's 11. So the couple of years was from 5, now 9, and now it's in 11. So it is the global warming potential of 11 a main problem for how we see hydrogen in our economy. Latest studies say no, but it is an issue for infrastructure, because it means we need to limit leakage. And if we need to limit leakage, that goes into how we transport and where we store, or avoiding transporting hydrogen and having co-location. So the global warming potential is going to be also playing a role, especially as we move to net zero, beyond net zero targets. And then we have, of course, fuel distribution. You want to fuel, actually, we are not producing fuel for the sake of producing fuels, but because they have a service. And they have to reach the customer. And now I managed to do this. And that is something that people sometimes speak, and is this discussion between centralized and decentralized. What is the infrastructure of the future, and centralized respect to what? Where do we centralize and take advantage of economies of scale, and where we decentralize and take advantage of economies of numbers or economies of location? But whatever you are doing, if you are centralizing, you have to move feedstock. If you are decentralizing, you have to move also the product to the customer. So your infrastructure can be done, but will look quite different. Now, when we look at infrastructure, and these are all maps, a lot of projects, we are busy producing this kind of roadmaps and how it look like, how will current infrastructure be used? For the people that we were working on CCS 10 years ago, there was a long discussion about using the current natural gas pipelines to use for CO2 transport. Now the discussion is to use the natural current pipelines for hydrogen. That's okay, but you just need CO2, you still need a new infrastructure. Left or right, you will need to build something there. Who decides what? And that's the discussion we have this morning. Who is going to make the billion-dollar infrastructure decision if there is no targets or policy stability? Because infrastructure in general is not something that you build for 2 or 3 or 5 years. It's a long-term decision. And if you don't do it in a flexible way, then you have a lock-in situation. And you can do lock-in on purpose or by accident. Hopefully we do it on purpose, but they will be there. And then we have, what is the new infrastructure that needs to be in place, assuming we can use as much of the assets that we have. When does it have to be built? Where? And who is paying for that? And those are all the questions that go back and forward and have a little bit of the chicken and egg kind of problem of demand and supply, and I don't build because I don't have the infrastructure. I'm not going to give you an infrastructure. I don't know if I have a demand. So at some point, intervention needs to happen, and that's a little bit what is happening at the moment. Now, when we speak, and this is just, I think many of you know, just to say, when we speak about infrastructure, and I speak infrastructure about hydrogen, for instance, it's all these elements that you need to think a little bit about. You know, what will be my primary energy source? What am I moving? Where I am producing? What am I converting to? What is the transport, the storage, the reconversion, and the utilization? If you put it in terms of hydrogen, this is what you right now find if you look in literature. So you like a number of options in each of these steps, and how you put these options together may or not change your infrastructure. People are thinking, you know, what can I use? Of course, natural gas or natural gas with CCS to produce hydrogen. Can I use nuclear? You know, all the rainbow of colors that we are so fond in Europe, and nobody speaks about colors in that way. Purple hydrogen, blue hydrogen, green hydrogen, white hydrogen. Yeah, white plasma hydrogen is the last one. That's white hydrogen. Yellow hydrogen. So how do you put it? Do you convert? In what do you convert? Do you transport in liquid, in gas, in solid phase? Do you transport it by pipeline or trunk? So it's a multimodal problem that is not foreign to how we have developed infrastructure in the past. But now we kind of need to do it in a coordinated manner with other systems, with the power system, with the transformation of the chemical sector. So you want things to go a little bit aligned, and that's part of the issue. Of course, there's a whole lot of discussion of, are you moving hydrogen, for instance, from Middle East or from the United States, and you move it here, and if you transport it in shipping, you generally prefer liquid or solid, and therefore you have different kind of components. And the global warming potential of 11 also plays a role here on how do I transport it and avoid, you know, volatility, and most likely then it would have been, you know, for the people here, I have here ammonia, I have here methanol, all of them are in the picture, no decision taken, and it's a very difficult situation to assess, but you can identify kind of bottlenecks and infrastructure needs and what we call the critical infrastructure that needs to be in place. Now, that's with hydrogen. CO2 is not necessarily easier. So CO2 as a feedstock, and we see CO2 is CO2 as a molecule, that's right. From a carbon footprinting, that's not the case. So in carbon footprinting, we take the origin of the carbon into account, and I think that is the reference that was just made, that they are using carbon from a steel mill. So therefore, it's fossil carbon, compared to using carbon from the atmosphere, compared to using carbon from biomass. Now, what do we have just in general? I don't know how many people, I do also life cycle assessment as part of the techno-economic analysis we do in the group. So you have a direct contribution of CO2 utilization. No, the first one is not for fuels, my apology, the first one is for utilization. And that is when I permanently store the CO2 in a product. That generally mineralization kind of products. In that case, the product you are producing takes credit for the CO2 that is embedded in the product and the CO2, minus the CO2 that was, you know, sent when I was building the product or processing the product. That's direct contribution. Fuels do not have that direct contribution because inherently you combust them and they go back. Now, fuels, and that's what people are arguing, has an indirect contribution, and it's a contribution of displacement. You know, and then I re-emit, but even though I emit less. So if carbon is from biogenic or atmospheric, theoretically, and I say theoretically because it depends how you capture, how you transport all the energy in the middle, you could reach neutral to negative even, depending how you set the system. If carbon is of fossil origin, doesn't matter how you see it, it's going to be emitted, so it's going to add. but it's going to add less than it would have happened if we use fresh fossil fuels. That's what we call the displacement effect. Now, I think Herjan pointed out this morning, that will decrease over time. As we decarbonize the background, the displacement effect will be lower and lower in time. Now, do I invest on something? And that is where in discussions, I've been in discussion last week with a lot of stakeholders in the States. They said, well, do we want to invest on something unlikely? It's not going to be sustainable in the long term. And if that is the case, then I'm left with waste and with biofuels or with atmospheric CO2. And the atmospheric CO2 has a caveat. Only makes sense if 100 kilometers away or 100 meters away, I'm not emitting concentrated CO2 into the atmosphere. Because as a system, I'm emitting concentrated CO2 to the atmosphere, and I'm capturing a little bit farther away at 450 ppm. I'm not certain that it's any way near clever. So the assumption of using carbon from the atmosphere and be helpful for climate change, the parts that we are stopping emitting 30% concentrated CO2 in the neighborhood. Otherwise, it doesn't make much sense. So fossil origin carbon is in many places not considered a sustainable alternative over time. It could be a transition, but not over time. And that over time makes investors very, very nervous, also in infrastructure. And the question, of course, is, where do we place unavoidable emissions? And who defines what unavoidable emissions is? And if I have unavoidable emissions, shouldn't I use those better than emitted directly if they are indeed unavoidable? And that's a policy discussion that has not finished and is just starting. Who decides what is unavoidable, related to what, at what level, and on which time frame? Now, why is this important for infrastructure? It's because these are the CO2 sources in Europe, and I saw this morning that the pointer seems not to be working. Oh, no, it's working. If we decide carbon that comes from fossil sources is not sustainable, then I'm going to focus a lot. The infrastructure is not going to focus on a lot of this. This is all fossil until now. It will be a little bit around the biogenic sources and DAC. And then I will develop a completely different infrastructure that I say, oh, wait a second, I'm going to consider the CO2 that comes from lime in cement because somebody said that is unavoidable. I'm going to take that as my CO2 sources, and then suddenly I have all the blue points I have to have into the network. So in terms of infrastructure, if you decide carbon is, do we use the chemical industry, fossil sources, CCS will be there, can we take CO2 from the pipeline? I will develop the infrastructure quite different if we say, no, that is not a sustainable carbon source. I need other sources. I will not put my DAC unit, I don't have to put it in the places where I already produce it unless I want to co-locate. So those are just for photons. This is major CO2 emitting industries and whether or not, because you could say, well, what if that industry used bioenergy? Then the carbon, then I can use the infrastructure. But you see right now, we are far away from that. And on competition, where do we use it? Do I use it? Do I have a cascading concept? Do I use it first here, and then I take the CO2, and then I use it for fossil fuels? From a system point of view, it's quite different. I don't know if you have seen this one. It was published, I think, 2 weeks ago by PwC, and it's speaking about the green infrastructure transition. And what you see in this arrow is we can say, we are going to green our infrastructure, but not everyone around the world has the means to do so. On the other arrow, on the other axis, you have how pollutant you are at this moment. So here, and here are we, at least in this scoring they did. So we are in the top left. We have high CO2 emissions, but they are slowly falling. We have high level of existing infrastructure, natural gas, pipelines, electricity infrastructure. And theoretically, we are in the best case scenario. There is some economic capacity to invest and change the infrastructure. Where are developing countries? And you see countries like Brazil and India, they are not there. They are in the in rising CO2 emissions kind of corner. They are in some infrastructure here, or almost, or lacking a lot of infrastructure, has to be built from zero, and really low capacity to pay. And this is a challenge at system level, especially when we are thinking on importing. So we are going to import, we are going to put in the developing countries the panels to make the hydrogen, transport the hydrogen with what infrastructure? And who's going to pay for that? So those are things that we need to, think and balance over time. And I know I'm bringing more questions to answer, but that's my job, so that's nice. And I just make a kind of summary of what I think are some of the challenges to enable the infrastructure. And one of them is, the lack of understanding of actually how the system develops. And I was speaking in the launch, and we say a lot of people think that our energy system now is complex, but they don't know how complex it is. And they think we are moving to a more simple system. And the reality is not. We are moving to even a more complex system with distributed sources and intermittency and small-size production facilities. So that already is a very difficult thing to understand and to argue with public policymakers. There is, I think, in many levels, inadequate policy guidance. And what policy guidance is what is the role of the different sectors stable over time, and I think we are getting better at there. What is, the policy design that really mash together. So I was discussing last week with the States, people in the States, and they say, if I want to have a business case for fuels, I will do the following. I will explore natural gas. I will make hydrogen of natural gas. I will capture the CO2 with CCS. I will transport the hydrogen. I will put a direct air capture unit. I will take CO2 from the air, and I will make methane again, and I will sell it. And because the policy and incentives to store for CCS, for DAC, and for green methane, I will have a business case. Is that what we want to do? That kind of, explore methane to make methane, and in the meanwhile, actually burn subsidies. That's what you are doing. So that kind of guidance, where you have the policy mechanisms and the policy instruments really tying together to avoid these bypasses, is needed. We have a challenging permitting environment. I think we have a whole lecture on that. I don't need to say what happened. Yeah, that is the water. There is water, and we are wasting it. Thank you. Everyone was listening, like, what is that? So we have a challenge permitting environment. We already spoke about that. Uncertainty in cost, and cost not only in CapEx. Liability is an issue. Risk spreading is an issue. And what is the role of government in there? And we have a lack of public awareness and varying support. I think we have sold a very romantic view of the energy transition with no losers, no trade-offs, all good and kind of paradise. And then they are confronting with trade-offs and choices that have to be made. And I think we need to be a little bit more realistic that it's going to cost us pain, but also there are going to be trade-offs. And some of them, harder than others, and need to deal with those instead of trying to just gain the public with a picture of, it's going to happen. But that's my view. I think it's firing back on us in terms of support. And the concern of continuing fossil fuel use, I think, is a really valid one if by the example I just showed you what can happen with the mechanisms, where at the end of the day you will keep extracting natural gas to produce natural gas, but now in a very interesting, very technology inefficient route, to quote how you started this morning, and therefore we close with the same words. Thank you very much.